He woke up in the most expensive room in the hospital and did not know his own name. A billionaire 64-years-old builder of a $6 billion empire lying under white sheets with nothing inside his head but silence. For 17 days no one came. Not his ex-wife, not his son who lived 25 minutes away, not his daughter who had been informed within the hour, not a single partner from the company that bore his name. The only person who came was a woman who had not worked for him in 6 years. She arrived on the 18th morning with a folding chair and a small container of food she had cooked in her own kitchen. She was 61 years old. She had been his housekeeper for 9 years before she was let go. She was not there for money. She was not there for a job. When a nurse asked her why she had come, she said only this: "He was kind to me once, in a way that cost him something. I never forgot it." Bennett Ashford was 64 years old. 6'2" with hands that were too large for the suits he now wore and fingers that still carried calluses from a life. The suits were meant to make people forget. They did not make Bennett forget. He had started at 19, fixing other people's houses in Macon, Georgia, for cash that he folded into small rectangles and kept in his left pocket, each bill facing the same direction, because when you have very little, you learn to know exactly where every dollar is. The habit never left him. 45 years later, with $6.2 billion in commercial real estate across the American South, Bennett Ashford still folded his money into small rectangles and placed them in his wallet with the precision of a man who remembered what it felt like to have only one. Ashford Development Group. 14 commercial towers. 3 mixed-use complexes under construction. A corporate headquarters in Midtown Atlanta with his name on the building in letters that could be read from the interstate. Built from nothing. Built by one person who had borrowed $3,800 at 24 to buy a condemned duplex on the south side of Macon, gutted it with his own hands, rented both units, and used the rent to buy the next one. His voice in a boardroom was quiet, not soft, quiet. The kind of quiet that makes a room lean forward, not because the speaker is uncertain, but because the speaker has no need to be loud. This was more unsettling than volume, and everyone who worked for him understood it. What the boardroom did not know, what the towers and the contracts and the letters on the interstate did not tell anyone, was the rest of it. He had been married to Nadine for 22 years. They had divorced 8 years ago. The proceedings had been efficient and expensive, and had left the kind of silence between two people that is worse than argument, the silence of people who have simply stopped finding each other necessary. He had 2 children, Marcus, 38, Camille, 34. Both worked for Ashford Development Group in positions that had been created for them rather than earned by them. Bennett knew this. He did not say it. He believed that time would do what conversation could not, that eventually they would grow into the roles the way he had grown into buildings by standing inside them long enough. He was wrong about this, but he did not know it yet, and the not knowing had become its own kind of patience. On a Tuesday night, 6 years before the accident, Bennett had been sitting in his kitchen at 2 in the morning. The overhead light was off. Only the small light above the stove was on the one that turned the kitchen into something smaller and quieter than it was during the day. Lorene Sable, who had been his housekeeper for 9 years, had come downstairs for water and found him there. Something happened in that kitchen that Lorene never told anyone and Bennett never acknowledged in daylight. It sat between them afterward, the way certain truths sit between people who understand that some things are too honest for ordinary hours. 3 weeks later, Nadine filed for divorce. And in the machinery of separation, Lorene was let go. Lorene Sable was 61. Born in Albany, Georgia, the kind of small southern town that people describe by what it does not have rather than what it does. She had no college degree. She had started cleaning houses at 22, and by the time she was 30, she had become the kind of housekeeper who knew what a house needed before the house knew it itself. The creak that meant a hinge was going. The silence that meant a filter needed changing. The particular quality of dust that said a room had not been entered in too long. Her husband, Jerome, had died 12 years before. Lung cancer. 14 months from the diagnosis to the end. She had been with him for every one of those months, sleeping in a chair beside his hospital bed, until the nurses stopped asking her to go home and simply brought her a blanket each night. She had one son, Devin, 29, living in Houston. He called every Sunday. He always said, "Mama, come live with me." She always said, "I have things here." She never specified what the things were. Devin had stopped asking. She had worked for the Ashford household for 9 years. She had not been fired by Bennett. She had been fired by Nadine, who, in the weeks following the divorce filing, had dismissed every member of the household staff in what appeared to be an act of erasure rather than economy. Lorene had received the call on a Thursday. She had thanked Nadine for the years. She had packed her cleaning supplies into a plastic bin, placed it in the trunk of her car, and driven home. She did not resent the firing. She did not resent Nadine. She simply moved on the way. She moved through everything with her whole attention on the next thing that needed doing. Bennett had not known about the firing until after the divorce was final. By then, months had passed. He did not reach out. Lorene did not expect him to. Whatever had happened in that kitchen at 2 a.m. existed in a space that neither of them could access through a phone call or a letter. So it remained where it was undisturbed, like a room in a house that no one opens but no one empties. She was working now at a Marriott on the north side of Atlanta. $16.50 an hour, cleaning rooms that other people passed through and forgot. She lived in a one-bedroom apartment near the bus line. It was small and orderly. The surfaces had the particular shine of a woman who believed that dignity lived in the details, even the ones nobody would see. She kept a small leather-bound notebook in her purse. She had carried one like it for decades. Inside, she wrote the things that mattered about every household she served. Birthdays, allergies, preferences, habits, the small facts of a life that most people do not think anyone notices. The section on Bennett Ashford was 11 pages long. She had not opened it in 6 years. But she had not removed it either. It was a Wednesday, 9:14 in the evening. Bennett was driving south on I-85, coming from the office heading toward the house in Buckhead that was too large for one person and had been too large for one person for 8 years. He was in the left lane. A Lexus LS Black, the kind of car that moves through traffic the way its driver moved through rooms quietly without drawing attention. The SUV crossed the median at approximately 60 miles per hour. It came from the northbound lanes over the grass divider and into the southbound left lane where Bennett was traveling. The driver of the SUV was later determined to have suffered a cardiac event behind the wheel. He was dead before the vehicles made contact. The impact was head-on. The front of the Lexus folded inward in a way that made the car look like it was trying to close itself. Glass moved through the cabin. The airbag deployed and then deflated, its purpose spent in less than a second. The smell was rubber and heat and the particular chemical odor of a deployed airbag, which smells like nothing else and which everyone who has experienced it remembers. Bennett was unconscious. Fire and rescue arrived in 7 minutes. It took them 22 minutes to cut the driver's side door open and extract him from the vehicle. He was transported to Grady Memorial Hospital in Atlanta. The emergency team recorded the following traumatic brain injury: 3 fractured ribs, internal bruising, lacerations to the face and forearms. Glasgow Coma Scale score of 6 upon arrival. Surgery lasted 6 hours. He survived. 4 days later, he opened his eyes. He looked at the ceiling. He looked at it the way a newborn looks at light, not recognizing it but knowing it was important. A nurse asked him his name. He did not answer. She asked again. He looked at her with an expression that was not confusion exactly, but something closer to the blankness of a person standing in a house. They have never entered opening doors that lead to rooms they do not recognize. He did not know his name. He did not know he had children. He did not know about the 14 towers, or the 3 complexes, or the $6.2 billion, or the letters on the building that could be seen from the highway. Among his personal effects, cut from the vehicle and placed in a labeled bag by the paramedics, were the following: a wallet containing 8 bills folded into small, neat rectangles, a phone with a cracked screen, a set of keys, and a single piece of paper found in the inside pocket of his jacket. The paper was a handwritten list. The handwriting was Bennett's. The contents of the list were not read by anyone at the hospital. They placed it in the bag with everything else and stored it in the closet of his room. Marcus Ashford arrived at Grady Memorial 3 hours after his father was admitted. He lived in Brookhaven. The hospital was 25 minutes from his apartment. He had been at a fundraiser when the call came and had finished his conversation before leaving, which told you something about Marcus Ashford that nothing else needed to add. He went directly to the attending physician, Dr. Yolanda Price, a neurologist who had been practicing for 23 years and had seen enough families in crisis to read the room before anyone spoke. Marcus asked about the prognosis. He used the word incapacitated, not hurt, not, is he okay? Incapacitated. Dr. Price noted the word. She answered his medical questions. She did not answer the one he had not yet asked, but was clearly building toward, which had to do with legal authority over decisions that were not medical. Camille Ashford arrived 5 hours after admission. She had been in Miami. She was not alone. Beside her was a man in a gray suit carrying a leather folder. Reginald Pace, her personal attorney, who had boarded the same flight from Miami and who had, based on the creases in his suit, not changed clothes for the trip. Camille went to the nurse's station and asked about financial access and emergency signatory power before she asked what floor her father was on. They stood at his bedside together. Bennett was conscious. His eyes were open. The monitors kept their rhythm. Marcus said, "Dad." Bennett looked at him. There was no recognition. Not hostility, not confusion, just the absence of connection, the way you look at a stranger in an elevator. Polite, distant, and waiting for the door to open. Camille said her name. Bennett blinked. He looked at her face with the attention of someone trying to solve a problem they do not have the tools for. Nothing arrived. He looked back at the ceiling. They stayed for 20 minutes. Marcus spoke to Dr. Price in the hallway. Camille spoke to Reginald Pace. When they walked to the elevator together, Marcus said, "If he does not recover cognitive function, we need to move on the trust restructuring before the board does." Camille pressed the button. The elevator doors opened. She stepped inside and said, "I already have." The doors closed. The hallway was empty. In the room behind them, their father sat in the bed with his hands resting on the white sheet, his fingers slowly folding the edge of the fabric into a small, neat rectangle. He did not know why he was doing it. He just knew that his hands wanted to. Dr. Price sat them both down in the consultation room the following morning. Marcus in the chair closest to the door. Camille beside him with Reginald Pace standing against the wall behind her, his leather folder closed on his lap. Dr. Price explained it plainly. She had done this before. She did not soften it, and she did not dramatize it. She simply laid out what was true. The condition was called retrograde amnesia. It was caused by the traumatic brain injury sustained in the crash. What it meant in practical terms was this: Bennett could speak. He could reason. He could follow a conversation, form new thoughts, make decisions about what he wanted for lunch or whether the window should be open or closed. His present mind was intact. What was gone was everything behind him: his long-term memory, his history, the name of his company, the faces of his children. The 40 years of work that had built everything the two people sitting in front of her were now trying to protect. She told them that approximately 1.5 million Americans suffer traumatic brain injuries each year. Of those, roughly 10 to 20% experience some form of lasting memory loss. Bennett was in that percentage. She told them that his procedural memory, the kind that lives in the body rather than the mind, appeared to be undamaged. He could dress himself. He could tie his shoes. He could fold things into neat rectangles without knowing why his hands wanted to do it. Marcus asked how long recovery would take. Dr. Price said, "There is no timeline. Memory recovery after TBI is not linear. It does not follow a schedule. It follows stimulation, familiar voices, familiar routines, familiar smells and sounds and stories from the patient's life. The brain needs anchors. It needs repeated, consistent exposure to people who knew the patient before the injury. That is the single most effective factor in recovery that we have documented," she said. "It depends on who shows up." Marcus looked at Camille. Camille looked at her phone. Reginald Pace did not look at anyone. The first 3 days they came. Both of them. Every day. 30 minutes. Sometimes 45. 3 days, they sat in the chairs beside Bennett's bed and spoke to each other about the things that concerned them, the trust structure, the board's interim appointment of a temporary CEO, the quarterly filings that needed a signature they could not currently obtain. They spoke about these things in Bennett's presence, near Bennett's body, in Bennett's room, but they did not speak to Bennett. Bennett sat in the bed and watched them. He did not understand the words they used. He did not understand the papers they brought. He understood something else, something that did not require memory to recognize. On the second day, after Marcus and Camille had left, Bennett asked the nurse a question. He said, "Are those people my children?" The nurse said, "Yes." Bennett was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "They do not seem comfortable here." The nurse did not write this in the chart. She thought about it for the rest of her shift. By day 4, Marcus began coming every other day. His visits were shorter, 15 minutes, sometimes 12. He would stand at the foot of the bed, ask Dr. Price for an update in the hallway, and leave. Camille stopped coming altogether. She called the nurses' station instead. The calls were brief. She asked about legal competency assessments. She asked about timelines for guardianship proceedings. She rarely asked how he was feeling. When she did not wait for the full answer before asking her next question. On day 8, Marcus came for the last time. He brought a document. It was a medical power of attorney form. He placed it on the bedside table and explained to Bennett slowly, as though speaking to someone who did not understand English, rather than someone who did not understand his own past, that this was a standard document, that it was for Bennett's protection, that it simply allowed Marcus to make decisions on his behalf while he recovered. Bennett looked at the document. He could not read it. Not because the words were too complex, but because the words required a context he no longer had. He did not know what Ashford Development Group was. He did not know what a trust was. He did not know why the man standing beside his bed was in such a hurry. But he could read the man, and what he read was a person trying to reach the end of something as quickly as the paperwork would allow. Bennett did not sign. He said, "I would like to wait." Marcus took the document and left. He did not come back. Days 9 through 17. No one came. The room was large. It was on the 4th floor. It had a window that faced the parking lot, and beyond it the tree line along the edge of the hospital campus. The light came in each morning around 7:15, moved across the floor in a slow diagonal, and reached the far wall by noon. Bennett watched it every day. He did not know he was watching it. He simply sat in the chair by the window each morning, because the chair was there and the light was there, and sitting in it felt like the thing to do. The room was very clean. The sheets were changed daily. The monitors beeped at intervals that had become familiar enough to disappear. There was a television mounted on the wall that Bennett never turned on. There was a phone on the bedside table that never rang. On day 14, a nurse named Constance, who had been assigned to his floor for 3 shifts that week, wrote the following in his chart. Patient calm. No visitors in 9 days. Patient cooperative with all care protocols. Patient asked today, "Does anyone know I am here?" She put down her pen. She looked at the note. She added nothing else. On the 17th day, in the break room of a Marriott on the north side of Atlanta, Lorene Sable was eating lunch. A turkey sandwich on wheat bread, an apple, a bottle of water she refilled from the tap each morning because the vending machine charged $2 for something that came free from the faucet. She had her phone open. She was not a woman who spent much time on her phone, but she read the news during lunch the way she did most things, methodically from the front page backward. The article was on page 6 of the Atlanta Journal-Constitution's digital edition. A small item, 3 paragraphs. Ashford Development CEO in critical condition after I-85 crash. It gave his name. It gave the date. It gave the hospital. It did not give much else. Bennett Ashford had never been the kind of wealthy man who appeared on magazine covers or spoke at conferences. He built things. He did not talk about building them. The article reflected that. Brief, factual, and already 2 weeks old by the time Lorene found it. She put the phone down. She looked at the sandwich. She did not pick it up again. She thought about the kitchen. She thought about 2 in the morning, and the stove light, and the man sitting at the table. She thought about what had happened that night, and then she did what she always did with that memory. She folded it back into the place where she kept it and moved on to the next thing. She reached into her purse and took out the leather notebook. She opened it to the section marked with a small tab she had cut from an index card 6 years ago. 11 pages. She read them the way a person reads something they already know by heart, but need to see in their own handwriting to believe. Allergies, none. Breakfast preference, scrambled eggs, no salt toast cut diagonal. Coffee black, no sugar, served in a plain white ceramic mug with no pattern. Morning routine, wake at 5:15. Sit in the kitchen for 20 minutes before beginning the day. No conversation during those 20 minutes. She had learned the no conversation rule on her 3rd day working for him. She had never broken it. She closed the notebook. She finished her shift. She clocked out at 3:45. She drove home to the 1-bedroom apartment near the bus line. She changed out of her uniform. She went into the kitchen. She made scrambled eggs, no salt. She made toast and cut it diagonal. She placed both in a small container and sealed the lid. She set her alarm for 5:30 in the morning. She went to bed. She did not rush. She was 61, and rushing had never been her way. She arrived at things the way weather arrives. Not suddenly, but completely. The next morning she drove to Grady Memorial Hospital. She parked in the visitor lot. She walked through the front entrance carrying the container in one hand and a folding chair in the other, because she had learned long ago that hospitals never had enough chairs in the right places. She went to the reception desk on the 4th floor. The woman behind the desk looked at her. Lorene was wearing a clean coat, not new, well kept. Comfortable shoes, the kind made for standing long hours on hard floors. She had the container of food in her right hand and the folding chair tucked under her left arm. "I am here to visit Bennett Ashford," she said. The receptionist looked at the screen. She looked at Lorene. "Are you family?" "No," Lorene said. "I used to work for him. Only family members are permitted to visit patients in this unit." Lorene stood very still. She said, "Has any family visited him in the last week?" The receptionist looked at the screen again. There was a pause that answered the question before the receptionist could. Then the receptionist said, "Let me check with the attending nurse." Dr. Price came to the reception area 12 minutes later. She looked at Lorene. She looked at the food container. She looked at the folding chair. She said, "You worked for Mr. Ashford 9 years, Lorene said. "I was his housekeeper," Dr. Price said. "How well did you know him?" Lorene said, "I knew how he took his coffee. I knew the sound he made when he thought no one was listening. I knew which room he went to when he was sad. I knew what he ate for breakfast every morning for 9 years. I knew that he folded his money into small rectangles and that he did not like to be spoken to before 5:35 in the morning. I worked for him for 9 years. Dr. Price was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "That is more than his children have told me in 17 days. She signed Lorene in. She walked her down the corridor. She opened the door. Bennett was sitting in the chair by the window. The morning light had just reached the armrest. He was looking at the parking lot the way he looked at most things now, with the quiet attention of a man who had nothing to compare anything to. He turned when the door opened. He looked at Lorene. He did not recognize her. His face did not change the way a face changes when it sees someone it knows. But it did not do what it had done when Marcus and Camille walked in either. It did not go polite and distant and empty. Something else happened, something smaller. His brow moved slightly. His head tilted just barely, the way a person tilts toward a sound they cannot quite place. He looked at her the way a person looks at a song they cannot name but have heard before. Lorene did not introduce herself. She did not explain who she was. She did not say, "Do you remember me?" She set the folding chair beside the window. She sat down. She placed the food container on the bedside table. She opened it. Scrambled eggs. No salt. Toast cut diagonal. Bennett looked at the food. He looked at it for a long time. He did not know why, but something about the way it was arranged, the toast angle, The texture of the eggs, the absence of anything extra on the plate, made his hands relax on the armrests in a way they had not relaxed since he had woken up in this room. He picked up the fork. He ate, slowly, in silence. Lorene sat in her chair and looked out the window. She did not watch him eat. She did not ask if it was good. She sat with her hands folded in her lap and her back straight, and she was quiet the way she had been quiet in his kitchen at 5:15 every morning for 9 years. When the food was gone, she stood. She closed the container. She folded the napkin and placed it inside. She picked up the chair. She said, "I will come back tomorrow." She walked to the door. She opened it. She stepped through. Behind her, Bennett sat in the chair by the window. The light had moved to his knees. He looked at the empty container on the table. He looked at the door that had just closed. He pressed the call button. The nurse came. "Constance," she said. "Everything all right, Mr. Ashford," Bennett said. "The woman who was just here. Yes, she knew how I eat." It was the first sentence he had spoken in 17 days that was not a question. Constance wrote it in the chart. She underlined it once. Then, she went back to her station and sat quietly for a moment before moving on to the next room. On the second day, Lorene brought coffee. Black, no sugar, in a white ceramic mug with no pattern. She had found the mug at a Goodwill on Peachtree Industrial for $2.30. It was not the same mug, but it was the same kind, plain, white. Heavy enough to feel like it was holding something that mattered. She poured the coffee from a thermos she had carried in her bag. She set the mug on the bedside table. Bennett looked at it. He reached for it. His fingers closed around the handle and then moved to the body of the mug, wrapping around the ceramic the way hands wrap around something they have held before. He turned it once, slowly. His fingers found the weight of it familiar, the way hands remember a doorknob in the dark. He drank. He did not say anything. Lorene sat in her chair by the window and was quiet. On the fourth day, she began talking. Not about his company, not about his net worth, not about the buildings or the contracts or the board. She talked about small things, things that lived in the notebook. She said, "You liked the kitchen at 5:15 in the morning when it was still dark. You never turned on the overhead light, just the one above the stove. You said once that the overhead light made the kitchen feel like a hospital. You wanted it to feel like a kitchen." Bennett listened. He was looking out the window while she spoke at the parking lot at the tree line beyond it. Then he turned his head slightly. He said, "I think I know that light." Lorene did not react. She did not lean forward. She did not say, "You remember." She simply nodded once and let the sentence sit where it was. On the table between them, the white mug held the last of the coffee gone cold. On the sixth day, Dr. Price stopped Lorene in the hallway before her visit. She said, "He is doing something with money, folding it into small rectangles. He does it with any piece of paper napkins, the edge of his bedsheet. He does not seem to know why." Lorene said, "He has done that since I knew him." Dr. Price said, "Procedural memory. The body remembers what the mind does not. The hands keep doing what they have always done, even when the person cannot tell you why." She paused. She said, "In neuroscience, we call this implicit memory. It lives in a different part of the brain than the memory of events. It is stored in the basal ganglia and the cerebellum, not the hippocampus, which means that a person who has lost every memory of who they are can still tie their shoes, still fold paper into the shape their fingers learned 20 years ago, still feel safe in the presence of someone they cannot name." She looked at Lorene. She said, "What you are doing is not visiting. It is treatment. The brain needs anchors. You are giving him anchors." Lorene went into the room. Bennett was sitting in the chair. He had a $5 bill in his hands. He was folding it, slowly, into a small, neat rectangle. He looked up at her and said, "I do not know why I do this." Lorene looked at his hands. Her own hands stopped on her knees for a moment. She said, "You have always done it. Since before I knew you." He looked at the rectangle of money. He placed it on the bedside table. He said, "It feels like counting, like making sure something is still there." Lorene said nothing. She opened the food container and set out his breakfast. On the 8th day, she brought music. Not a song he had liked. She did not know what songs Bennett listened to when he was alone. She knew what song she had played on Saturday mornings when she cleaned the house, because she had played the same one every Saturday for 9 years. A gospel track, old. The kind of song that is not about perfection, but about persistence. She played it from her phone quiet, the speaker resting on the bedside table between the mug and the folded bill. Bennett listened, his head turned toward the sound, the way a plant turns toward light, not by decision, but by design. His eyes closed. The song played for 2 minutes and 40 seconds. When it finished, he opened his eyes. He said one word, Saturday. Lorene nodded. She did not explain. She did not ask what he meant. She knew what he meant. She pressed play again. Stay with me. Because what happened next in that hospital was not luck, and it was not coincidence. It was the sound of a person being rebuilt one small piece at a time, by someone who had kept those pieces in a leather notebook for 6 years without knowing she would ever need them again. 2 weeks after Lorene's first visit, Marcus called the hospital. It was a Tuesday. He had not called in 11 days. The call went to the 4th floor nurse's station. Constance answered. Marcus asked about his father's condition. Constance gave him the standard update. Stable, cooperative, memory still absent but cognitive function strong. Then she said, his regular visitor is here right now if you would like me to pass along a message. Marcus said. What regular visitor? Constance said Miss Sable. She has been coming every day for the past 2 weeks. There was a silence on the line. Not a pause, a silence. The kind that comes when a person hears something they were not prepared for and needs a moment to rearrange the furniture in their mind before speaking. Marcus said, Thank you. He hung up. 40 minutes later, Marcus and Camille arrived at Grady Memorial together. They walked through the 4th floor corridor side by side with the pace of people who had somewhere specific to be and something specific to prevent. They turned the corner and found Lorene coming out of Bennett's room. She was carrying the empty food container in one hand. Her folding chair was under her arm. Marcus recognized her. He recognized her the way people recognize the help, quickly, categorically, and from above. Camille spoke first. What are you doing here? Lorene said, visiting. Camille said, You do not work for us anymore. You were let go 6 years ago. Lorene looked at her. She said, I was let go by your mother, not by your father, and I am not here for employment. Marcus stepped forward. He lowered his voice into something that was meant to sound reasonable. He said, Look, we appreciate your concern, we do. But Dad is in a fragile state. He does not know who you are. He does not know who anyone is. And having an unauthorized person spending hours in his room every day is not something we are comfortable with. Dr. Price appeared in the hallway behind them. She had been walking toward Bennett's room for a routine check. She stopped. She listened. She waited for Marcus to finish. Then she said, Miss Sable is the only consistent presence your father has had in 20 days. Her visits are not unauthorized. They are, from a medical standpoint, the only treatment that is currently producing measurable results. His verbal output has increased. His affect has shifted. He is engaging with stimuli in ways he was not engaging before she arrived. I approved her visits, and I will continue to approve them. Camille said she has no legal standing to be here. Dr. Price said she has no legal standing. She also has no agenda. I cannot say the same for everyone in this hallway. The corridor was very quiet. Marcus looked at Camille. Camille looked at Reginald Pace, who had materialized from somewhere behind them with his leather folder. Pace said nothing. He had been a lawyer long enough to recognize a sentence that could not be answered without making things worse. Lorene stood where she was. She did not argue. She did not defend herself. She held the empty container and the folding chair, and she stood in the hallway with her back straight and her face calm, and she waited for the moment to pass the way she had waited for many such moments in her life. She had been told she did not belong in places before. She had learned a long time ago that the most effective answer was to keep standing where she was. She remained standing where she was. Marcus and Camille went into Bennett's room. They stayed for 22 minutes. When they came out, neither of them looked at Lorene. They walked to the elevator. The doors opened. They stepped inside. The doors closed. Lorene went home. She cooked the eggs. She cut the toast. She set her alarm. She came back the next morning, and the morning after that, and the morning after that. The following week, something shifted. Lorene did not bring food. She brought words. She sat in the chair beside the window, and she began to tell Bennett Ashford about Bennett Ashford. Not the version his children knew, the buildings and the board and the net worth. The version she knew. The version that lived in the 11 pages of her notebook and in the 9 years of mornings she had spent in his house. She said, "You woke up at 5:15 every morning. You sat in the kitchen with the stove light on. You never spoke during those 20 minutes. I learned not to speak either. I would start the coffee, and we would both be quiet in the same room. It was the most peaceful 20 minutes of my day." Bennett listened. He was sitting in the chair. His hands were on the armrests. He did not move. She said, "You had a way of saying thank you that most people did not notice. You did not say the words often. You said it by remembering. If I mentioned once that my son was applying to a program 3 weeks later, you would ask how it went. That was your thank you. Most people say thank you with their mouth. You said it with your attention." She said, "You kept every birthday card your children ever made you in a drawer in your study. Bottom left. The drawer was organized by year. You thought nobody knew about it. I dusted that drawer every week for 9 years. I never opened the cards, but I dusted them, and I always put them back in the same order." Bennett looked at her. He did not remember these things. Not the kitchen, not the drawer, not the cards. But something about the way she described them had a weight to it that was different from anything Marcus or Camille had told him. They had told him about contracts. They had told him about the company structure. They had told him what he owned. Lorene was telling him who he was, and he could feel the difference not as memory but as something closer to recognition. The things she described did not come back to him as images or events. They came back as shapes. The shape of a man who woke up early because the quiet meant something. The shape of a man who said thank you by paying attention 3 weeks later. The shape of a man who kept birthday cards in a drawer and thought no one knew. He said, "That sounds like someone I would want to be." Lorene looked at him. She said, "It is someone you were." He was quiet for a long time after that. Then he said, "Tell me more." She told him more. Down the hall in the staff conference room, Dr. Price was conducting the weekly case review with her team. She had Bennett's file open on the table. She was explaining something to Dr. Ellis, a second-year neurology resident who had been assigned to the case as a learning opportunity. She said, "There is a common misconception that identity is stored in episodic memory, that who you are is the sum of the events you remember. This is incorrect. Identity is distributed across multiple memory systems. Episodic memory, yes, but also emotional memory, which is stored in the amygdala, and procedural memory, which is stored in the basal ganglia and the cerebellum. A patient with severe retrograde amnesia who has lost all episodic memory can still retain a functional sense of self." She said, "This is why Mr. Ashford folds paper into rectangles without knowing why. This is why his body relaxes when a certain person enters the room and tenses when another person enters. His amygdala is doing what it has always done. It is reading the emotional signature of the people around him and responding accordingly. He cannot tell you their names, but his body knows who is safe," Dr. Ellis said. "How do you measure that?" Dr. Price said heart rate drops when his former housekeeper is in the room. Blood pressure normalizes. Verbal output increases by approximately 40%. These are not opinions. They are numbers on the monitors. She said, "In traumatic brain injury recovery, the medical literature is clear. The single most effective environmental factor in memory restoration is not medication. It is not surgery. It is the consistent, repeated presence of people who were part of the patient's daily life before the injury. Familiar voices activate dormant neural pathways. Familiar routines create scaffolding for the brain to rebuild connections. The brain does not simply retrieve lost memories. It reconstructs them, and it needs the original materials to do that." She looked at Dr. Ellis. She said, "His children visit with lawyers. His former housekeeper visits with eggs. Tell me which one the brain recognizes as safe." Dr. Ellis did not answer. He did not need to. The monitors in room 412 were already answering every morning between 6:30 and 8 when the numbers shifted in ways that no medication in the hospital pharmacy could replicate. It was her 14th visit. The room was quiet. Not the quiet of absence which had filled the room for 17 days before she arrived, but the quiet of two people who had learned that silence between them was not empty. It was a different material entirely. It held. Lorene was sitting in her chair by the window. Bennett was in his chair beside the bed. The morning light had reached the middle of the floor. Neither of them was speaking. The coffee was finished. The food container was closed, Bennett said. There was a kitchen. Lorene did not move, Bennett said. The light was above the stove. It was late, not morning. Very late, Lorene said yes. Bennett said, "You were there." Lorene said yes. He was quiet for a moment. His hands were on the armrests. His fingers were still. He said, "I was sitting at the table." The big light was off, just the one above the stove. And I was. He stopped. He looked at his hands. He said I was crying. Lorene said nothing. He said, "Not the way people cry when something happens. The way people cry when they realize something has been true for a long time and they have just now stopped pretending it is not." He paused. He said, "I do not remember what was true, but I remember the crying, and I remember you were there." 6 years before the accident, 2 in the morning, the kitchen in the house in Buckhead. The overhead light was off. The stove light was on, casting its small warm circle on the counter and leaving the rest of the room in the kind of darkness that makes a large kitchen feel like a small, safe place. Bennett was sitting at the table. His hands were flat on the surface. He was crying, not loudly, not the way it happens in the moments after a shock. The way it happens when a man has held everything for so long that the holding itself has become the wound, and one morning the wound simply opens on its own, without permission, without warning. Nadine had told him that morning that she wanted a divorce. He had nodded. He had gone to work. He had run a meeting. He had signed documents. He had driven home. He had eaten dinner alone because Nadine had already moved to the guest room. And at 2 in the morning, sitting in the kitchen with the stove light on, he had begun to cry. Not because he was losing his wife, because he realized he was not sad about losing his wife. Because the absence of sadness told him something about the last 22 years that was worse than any sadness could have been. He had been alone inside his own marriage for longer than he could name, and the truth of it, arriving all at once in a dark kitchen, was more than he could hold in his hands. Lorene had come downstairs for water. She saw him. She stopped in the doorway. She did not say, "Are you okay?" She did not say, "What happened?" She did not say anything. She walked to the cabinet. She took out a glass. She filled it with water. She placed it in front of him on the table. Then she pulled out the chair across from him and sat down. She folded her hands in her lap. She looked at the stove light. She did not look at him. She sat with him for 45 minutes. Neither of them spoke. At some point the crying stopped. At some point the water was drunk. At some point the kitchen was just a kitchen again. 2 people sitting in it, one who had broken open and one who had not tried to put him back together, who had simply stayed while the breaking happened. Then Lorene stood up. She took the glass. She washed it. She dried it. She put it back in the cabinet. She said, "Good night, Mr. Ashford." She went upstairs. The next morning neither of them mentioned it. Not that day, not the next, not ever. But starting the following month, Bennett placed an extra $200 in Lorene's pay envelope. No note, no explanation. $200. Every month. For 8 months, until Nadine let her go and the envelopes stopped. In the hospital room, Bennett looked at Lorene. He said, "You stayed." Lorene said, "Yes." He said, "No one stays at 2 in the morning for the help." Lorene looked at him. She said, "You were not the help. You were a person in a kitchen who needed someone to sit with him. I was a person in a kitchen who knew how to sit." Bennett looked down at his hands. His fingers had found the edge of the hospital blanket. They were folding it, slowly, into a small, neat rectangle. He watched them do it. Lorene watched them do it. And something passed between them that did not require memory to understand, because it had never been stored as a memory in the first place. It had been stored as something older and quieter. The knowledge that in the worst hour of his life someone had sat across from him and not looked away. He said, "That night is the first thing I remembered. Not my name, not my company, not my children, that kitchen, that light, you." Lorene was still. Her hands were in her lap. She said, "Some things the brain keeps closer than others." He said, "Yes, I think it does." 3 days later, Marcus and Camille returned. This time, they did not come alone. Reginald Pace was with them, and beside him, a second attorney, a woman in a dark suit, whose name was Constance Devereaux, and whose specialty as doctor, Price would later learn, was guardianship and conservatorship law. They requested a meeting with Dr. Price in the consultation room. Marcus sat in the chair nearest the door. Camille sat beside him. The 2 lawyers stood behind them. Marcus presented their request. 3 points. First, they wanted Bennett declared legally incapacitated. Second, they wanted emergency guardianship granted to Marcus as the eldest child. Third, they wanted all non-family visitors removed from the patient's access list. He used the word safeguard. He used it 4 times. Dr. Price listened. She let him finish. Then she said, "Mr. Ashford has retrograde amnesia. He has lost his long-term memory. He has not lost his capacity for judgment reasoning or decision-making. He can tell you what day it is. He can tell you what he ate for breakfast. He can follow a conversation, form an opinion, and express a preference. He cannot tell you what he had for breakfast in 2019. He can tell you exactly what he wants for breakfast tomorrow. Those are not the same faculty." She said, "I will not certify him as incapacitated because he is not incapacitated, and the court will require my certification before any guardianship proceeding can move forward." Camille said, "He does not know who we are. He does not know who she is. He is being manipulated by a woman who has no connection to this family and no right to be in that room. She is a former employee. She was terminated, and she has been spending hours every day alone with a man who cannot remember his own name. That is not treatment. That is..." From the doorway of the consultation room, a voice said, "I am in the room." Everyone turned. Bennett was standing in the doorway. He was wearing the hospital gown and the robe the nurses had given him. He was holding the IV pole with one hand. He had walked down the corridor by himself. His face was calm. His voice was quiet. The quiet that is more frightening than loudness. He said, "I do not remember your names. I do not remember her name. But I remember what I feel when each of you walks through that door." The room was very still. He said, "When you walk in, I feel like a problem to be solved. When she walks in, I feel like a person. That is not manipulation. That is the difference." He looked at Marcus. He looked at Camille. He looked at the lawyers behind them. He said, "I would like you to leave. I would like her to stay. This is my decision. I am told I built something worth $6 billion. If I built that, I can certainly decide who sits in my hospital room." Marcus opened his mouth. Bennett raised one hand. Not commanding. "Just finished," he said. "Go home." They went. The lawyers went with them. The consultation room emptied. Dr. Price stood in the hallway and watched them leave and said nothing because there was nothing medical to add to what had just happened. Lorene appeared from the corridor. She had been standing around the corner. She had heard everything. She walked to Bennett and took the IV pole from his hand and steadied it. She said, "You did not have to say it like that." Bennett said, "I may not remember them, but I know what I felt when they were here. And I know what I feel when you are here. Those are facts. I do not need memory for facts." Lorene walked him back to his room. She sat him in the chair by the window. She gave him the white mug with the last of the coffee, now cold. He drank it anyway. She sat in her chair. They were quiet for a long time. The light moved across the floor the way it always did, slow and certain, reaching the far wall by noon. The memories came back the way weather changes. Not all at once, not on a schedule, in shifts, in pieces. Some mornings Bennett would wake and know something he had not known the night before. Some weeks, nothing moved. Week 5 after the accident, he said to Lorene. "My name is Bennett." She said, "Yes." He said it again slowly, as if hearing it for the first time. "Bennett Ashford." He said it the way a person says a word in a foreign language. They are just beginning to learn carefully, testing whether it fits in their mouth. Week 6. He said, "There was a house. Not here. Smaller. A town with a factory." Lorene said Macon. He said Macon. "Yes. My parents worked there." He was quiet for a moment. He said, "I remember the sound of the door when my father came home. I do not remember his face yet, but I remember the sound of the door." Week 7. He looked at Lorene and said $3,800. She waited. He said, "That was the first one, a duplex. I fixed it myself. The floor in the kitchen was so rotten, I fell through it on the second day." He paused. He said, "I remember laughing, standing in the hole up to my waist, laughing because what else was there to do?" Week 8. He woke up and he knew their faces. Marcus, Camille. He knew their names. He knew the way Marcus stood in a doorway, slightly to the left, the way he had stood since he was 14. He knew the way Camille held her phone always in her right hand, always close to her body as if it contained something she was protecting. He knew them. And knowing them was not the same as what he had felt before. Before, they had been strangers who made him feel like a problem. Now, they were people he remembered. And the remembering did not erase what he had felt when he did not remember. It confirmed it. The memories returned, not in the order they had been made, but in the order they mattered. The kitchen at 2 a.m. came first. Then Marcus's college graduation, which Bennett had attended uninvited, standing in the last row of the auditorium, because Marcus had not sent him a ticket, and Bennett had driven 3 hours to be there anyway, and had left before the ceremony ended so that Marcus would not have to decide whether to acknowledge him. Then the day Camille was born, and Bennett had held her in the delivery room and cried, and that had been the last time he cried for 30 years until the kitchen. The memories with the most feeling came back first, the ones that had cut the deepest grooves. He lay in the bed. Lorene sat beside him. He said, "I remember everything." Lorene said, "I know." He said, "I remember who they are. And I remember who you are. And I remember the difference." He was quiet. He said, "The difference was always there. I just did not say it out loud before." Lorene folded her hands. She said nothing. There was nothing to say to a man who had lost his entire life and gotten it back, and discovered that the thing he had been most afraid to admit before the accident was the first thing his brain chose to remember after it. Bennett pressed the call button. Constance came. He said, "My personal belongings. The bag from the car. Is it still here?" She brought it. The labeled plastic bag. He opened it. The wallet with the folded bills. The phone screen cracked. The keys. And the piece of paper. The handwritten list. He unfolded it. He read it. Lorene watched his face. The list said, "Call Marcus. Birthday next week." Then, Lorene Sable. Check address. Then, foundation. Housing for healthcare workers. He held the paper. He read it again. He read the second line a third time. Lorene Sable. Check address. He had been looking for her. Before the accident. Before the crash. Before any of this. He had been trying to find her. He had written her name on a piece of paper and put it in his jacket pocket, and he had not gotten to the next step because the SUV crossed the median on I-85 at 9:14 on a Wednesday night, and the next step became impossible. He held the paper out to Lorene. She took it. She read it. She read her own name in his handwriting. She was very still. He said, "I was coming back to you. I just did not get there in time." Lorene looked at the paper. She looked at the name. She folded it carefully the way she folded everything with precision and attention, and she placed it in the pocket of her coat. She said, "You got there." Bennett was discharged 11 weeks after the accident. Dr. Price signed the papers on a Thursday morning. She told him that his memory had recovered to approximately 85%. Some gaps would remain, small ones, a name here, a date there, rooms he had been in that he would never fully see again. She said, "That is normal. Brains are not filing cabinets, they are rivers. Some water returns to the same path, some finds a new one." He thanked her. She said, "Do not thank me. Thank the woman with the eggs." He met with Marcus first. The conversation took place in Bennett's office at Ashford Development Group, the first time he had been in the building since the crash. Marcus sat across the desk. Bennett sat behind it. The conversation lasted 2 hours. It was difficult. It was honest. It did not resolve everything. But it began. He met with Camille the following week. That conversation lasted 90 minutes. It was also difficult. It was also honest. It also did not resolve everything. But it also began. Bennett did not cut them off. He loved them. He was not certain they understood what that word required. He decided to teach them even if the lesson was late. He restructured the company. Marcus and Camille were removed from the positions that had been created for them. They could return, but they would have to start at the beginning the way he had started, the way everyone who earns something has to start. He told Marcus, "I gave you everything I never had. I did not give you the thing that made everything possible, which was the experience of having nothing. That was my mistake. I am correcting it now." Marcus did not speak for a long time. Then he said, "That is going to be hard." Bennett said, "Yes, it is." 6 weeks after discharge on a Saturday morning, Bennett drove to the west side of Atlanta. He parked on the street outside a small apartment building near the bus line. He walked up one flight of stairs. He knocked on the door. Lorene opened it. She was wearing a clean blouse and the comfortable shoes she always wore. The apartment behind her was small and orderly. One bedroom, a window that caught the morning light, a kitchen with a table and 2 chairs that had never both been used at the same time until today. She did not say, "Come in." She simply stepped aside. He walked in. He looked at the kitchen. He looked at the window. He looked at the light coming through it, landing on the table in a warm rectangle that reminded him of something he could not fully name, but that his body recognized immediately. He sat down. Lorene went to the stove. She made scrambled eggs. No salt. She made toast. Cut diagonal. She poured black coffee into a plain white ceramic mug with no pattern. She set it all on the table. She sat across from him. They did not speak. For 20 minutes they sat in the quiet of that kitchen the way they had always done before either of them knew the silence would matter this much. The light moved across the table. The coffee cooled. The eggs were good. When the 20 minutes had passed, Bennett said, "I would like to do something. For the people who do what you do," Lorene said. "What do I do?" Bennett looked at her. He said, "You show up every day. You do the work nobody sees. And when someone breaks, you sit with them at 2 in the morning and you do not leave." He said, "I want to build something for those people. Healthcare, housing, the things that the people who take care of everyone else never have enough of for themselves." Lorene looked at her hands on the table. She said, "That is a lot." He said, "It is not enough, but it is a start." He told her the name, the Sable Foundation. She looked at him. She said, "You do not have to name it after me." He said, "I want the name of someone who showed up. That is the whole point." She was quiet. She looked at the window. The light had moved past the table and was reaching the counter now. She said Jerome would have liked that. It was the first time she had mentioned her husband's name to Bennett in all the years she had known him. It sat in the room the way good things sit in rooms, gently without needing to be discussed. Bennett reached into his pocket. He took out a piece of paper, a small one. He folded it, slowly, into a small, neat rectangle. He placed it on the table between them. Lorene looked at it. He looked at it. Neither of them said anything, because some things do not need more words than the ones already in the room. Outside the window, Atlanta moved through its Saturday morning, the way it always did. Cars and buses and people walking to places they needed to be. Inside the kitchen, Two people sat at a table that had waited a long time for this. The eggs were finished. The coffee was cold. The light was everywhere. There is one question I want to leave you with. Not about the foundation, not about the billions, not about the memory or the crash or the hospital room. About the person in your life who showed up when no one else did. Who sat with you when sitting was all there was. Who remembered how you take your coffee when you had forgotten your own name. Write their name in the comments. Just the name. That is enough. That is everything. And if this story found something real in you, share it with someone who needs to hear that showing up is never small. Because somewhere out there someone remembers how you take your coffee, and they are not finished yet. A quick note. This story is fiction. The characters and events are imagined. But the medical information about traumatic brain injury and memory recovery is real. Every year, 1.5 million Americans experience TBI. The science around familiar presence and emotional memory is documented and ongoing. If someone you know is going through memory loss, your presence matters more than you think. I wrote this story because I believe we live in a world that measures people by what they own. But in the moments that matter, when the memory is gone, when the name is lost, when the room is empty, the people who matter are the ones who show up with scrambled eggs and silence. That is not a small thing. That is everything. See you in the next story.